Well, let's just get right into this. So, thinking or think of something cooler replied a couple of times. And so I'm going to just get right into it. Just to say, I think I'm doing it in the wrong order. And I think mainly the reason I'm starting here is because this is the first one I read. But I actually think it might work out better this way. And I'll do a part two for the other reply, I think. So let me start here and quick refresher anyway. So I'm going to say he says at 24:09, let's just quickly play it. So the people who would have fought in World War II, would their parents, if they survived, would have fought in World War One? I'm going to leave that because my mind isn't actually not able to process that, but I'll move on, right? So I think it gets explained here. So I'll just read here. So he says, yes, you have every right to be confused. All right, fair enough. I was rushing and did not make myself clear, replying on the fact that you may have seen that one. I know you say at some point later, rushing was me writing. I'd hate to see if you weren't rushing. You know what I mean? Well, look, I'm not saying that I'd hate to. Anyway, come on. I'm the same, all right? But look, we need to take the time. We need to take the time, or we need to take the time that we need in order to express ourselves. Not everything has to be a rush. And look, a lot of times it's the getting there that matters as much, if not more, than the destination itself. Right. Now, back to serious business here. I was speaking of multi-generational PTSD. So that's the phrase I couldn't think of last time, although I think I got the traumatic bit, but it's post-traumatic. Or maybe I said trauma, but anyway, post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think maybe the kids these days might be still saying they have PTSD or something along those lines. Doesn't matter. Shell shock was the World War One equivalent, I think. I don't know whether they thought of PTSD for World War Two yet, or whether that just came with Vietnam or something. Anyway, so he says, children of the 50s and 60s were angry, but their parents couldn't deal with it because they were in World War Two. Okay. And they, born in 40s or 30s, had parents who fought in or had children in or both World War One. Yeah. Okay, so that's, I think, the generational trauma. Of course, the kids these days use generational trauma for other things, indeed, don't they? I'm going to say it because I'm a member of the SRMB plus community. They use these phrases like, I have PTSD, boo-hoo, woe is me, even though they don't really. And I have generational trauma, boo-hoo, woe is me, even though they couldn't possibly. Or even if you could put it within the realms of bounds of possibility. That's why I said bounds, I think. Even if you could make it possible that they might have generational trauma, it would be objectively far less legitimate than the PTSD suffered from people having fought in World War One or World War Two or Vietnam or Korea. And other wars, let's say. And I'm not discounting anybody who went to Iraq, but it's these people who, well, I won't get into it. It's two things now that you just can't really mention. It's the picking raw materials for vestments, and it's the seemingly millions and millions of survivors who need to be paid generationally. That's why they need to have the trauma, isn't it? And of course, it's all about payment as well, because, of course, it's all nonsense, and it'll never happen. But actually, I kind of think it should, not because of the reasons people might think. You know what I'm getting at, right? The reparations. Because at least it might polarize people to sort of say, all right, listen, enough is enough now, or at least there can be no more normies of our people who will say that it doesn't affect them or what harm or whatever, but they probably still say that, because they still think tax money comes from other people or the government just make money. Right, I'm off into the weeds again. Better bring it back now on topic. And they, I better go back to the beginning of this paragraph. And they, born in the 40s or 30s, had parents who fought in or had children in or both World War One. I like that as well, putting everything in parentheses. You know, like as you were trying to, I'd say for me, cover every case base in a computer program. Anyway, remember people had more kids, so if you came home from war in 1918, you had kids within a 10 to 12 year range with 3 or 4 kids, and a 15 to 20 year range if you had more kids. Phew. That sounds like a lot today, but it did happen. Yeah, look, when I was in school, you know, Protestants used to always say about Catholics, or English used to always say about Irish, that there was a Monty Python thing about it, wasn't it, called the meaning of life? I think it was, you know, about Catholics popping out kids, you know, constantly kathunk, kathunk, like Dennis Leary would have said, I think, or maybe that was Bill Hicks. But when I was in school, I think that there were 1 or 2 families, like 1 or 2 kids in my class in primary school, let's say, anyway, junior school, you know, who would have had, like, say, 10, 12 brothers and sisters, that kind of thing, you know. Look, that was considered to be, you know, a remarkable thing, like, you know, noteworthy for sure. But the idea of the 2.4 children, which was, I remember, being popularized a lot in the UK throughout the 90s or maybe even late 80s, as being like sort of the typical or standard average number. I'm not sure if that would have been the case in Ireland. It could have been more like 3 to 4 would have been the average, you know. But I mean, a big part of that probably was, although I wouldn't have thought so, but it probably was because condoms and other forms of birth control simply were not available and were technically or strictly speaking or otherwise illegal if you weren't married in Ireland, right up until I think it was the early 90s. You know, and maybe people listening to this now might think the early 90s were eons ago. Just like I suppose I did in the 80s and 90s, I thought the 60s were eons ago. But anyway, but it wasn't. Right, back on topic here. So you have generations of parents. So you have generations of parents and children who are either shell-shocked or facing the fear of going to war, or both. It's a vicious cycle. Yeah, fair enough. Anyway, my point was that in The Wall by Pink Floyd, I'd guess he's, meaning Roger Daltrey, I think, or Roger Waters, and I suppose David Gilmour, but I think he's talking about Roger Waters here. I'd guess he's born in the 50s and his parents cannot deal with his anger, isolation and confusion. And in his music and film, he's speaking to children born in the 60s and early 70s. Now, I have a feeling that but maybe it is, I have a feeling it's Roger Waters' father died in World War One. Or, I don't know, but let's look it up. I should have looked this up beforehand, but I'm going to have a quick look up now. I'll just go to his Wikipedia page. Sorry for the delay. Now, he was born in 1943. That still makes him a boomer. I mean, the idea in my mind was always that people coming back or after World War II, or not even people coming back, but just people, even in this country, Ireland, let's say, who were neutral, technically or officially anyway, we'll say. Although I believe some Irish people would have fought under the English army. More fools them. But they would have been, you know, there were Irish people who fought in World War One and World War Two, and they still would have thought that they were heroes, you know, in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Look, I'll leave that to one side for the moment, but it's possible anyway for baby boomers to have been born before the end of the war. I always assumed that, you know, people here, let's say, or elsewhere, were saying, good, that's the end of the war. And of course, in history, like I figured it was 1945, you know. Oh, great, we can start copulating again now, you know, or maybe by, you know, early 45 or late 44, the writing was on the wall and they said, okay, I think it's prudential enough now to put one in the oven, so that by the time war is officially over, we can have some babies born for the baby boomer, right? And my conception of history probably did have that logical fallacy in it, where I kind of thought, that people could see ahead into what would be history. Sort of say, 1945 will be the end of the war. So if we could just hang on till then, we'll have a few kids. We'll start having children again. So you can see I'm just explaining, the kind of logical fallacies that then therefore could go on in anybody's head. The erroneous presumptions that somehow are wrong, but at the same time you make anyway. False assumptions or misconceptions or mal preconceptions. Anyway, so there's George Roger Waters. I don't know why I keep saying Waters, but anyway, it's probably because I'm just not familiar with these guys, to be quite honest with you. So Dark Side of the Moon was the album I couldn't think of the last time. That it's listed first. Maybe it was their first album, 1973, and The Wall was 1979. It calls them all concept albums. Wish You Were Here, 75, Animals, 77, The Final Cut, 83. But by the early 80s, there had become one of the most critically acclaimed. I was going to say there had become fractures in the band, or anyway, like I can't do the whole. I better not try and do the whole history of Pink Floyd here. I wanted to look up his father, right? So, Waters was born on 6th September 43, the younger of two boys, only two, to Mary, Nee White, maiden name in other words, 1913 to 2009, and Eric Fletcher Waters, 1914 to 1944. So he was born in 43 and his father died in 44. And Roger Waters was born in Great Bookham, or Bookham, Surrey. His father, the son of a coal miner, and Labour, that's the British Labour Party, Socialist Party, but I mean it's champagne socialist now through and through. So he was a Labour Party activist and a school teacher, a devout Christian, and a Communist Party member. My God. I'll just hover over. In other words, have a quick look. It was the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB. I've never heard of that, actually, to be honest with you. It says it was founded in 1920 through a merger of several smaller Marxist groups. Many miners joined the Communist Party of Great Britain in the 1926 general strike. In 1930, the CPGB founded the Daily Worker, which I presume is a newspaper of some kind. I'll move on and just see if I can find out how his father died. So in the early years of the Second World War, Walter's father was a conscientious objector who drove an ambulance during the Blitz. So that means he would have been, I suppose, working in London. I presume that's where the Blitz is mostly associated with, but I suppose it could have affected the rest of the country. So I'm sort of saying he might have stayed at home. How did he die then? He later changed his stance on pacifism, joined the Territorial Army. What is the British Territorial Army? Is it like a reserve army? It is the active duty volunteer reserve force of the British Army. It is separate from the regular reserve, whose members are ex-regular personnel who retain a statutory liability for service. Okay, a reserve force, we'll call it. Yeah, the Army Reserve was known as the Territorial Force from 1908 to 1921. Maybe it went under a slight rebranding, but that's how it originated anyway. He later changed his stance on pacifism, joined the Territorial Army, and was commissioned into the 8th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, as a second lieutenant on 11th September. No way. Let me count the ways, as Crow 777 would say. I won't get into him now, but I learned something recently that he might be more about the money than the truth. But anyway, Royal Fusiliers as a second lieutenant on 11th of September 1943. He was killed 5 months later on 18th of February. Anytime I try to concentrate on pronouncing words, I overpronounce them and pronounce them weird, like cool whip, like cool whip. In Family Guy, Stewie and Family Guy, cool whip. Was killed 5 months later On 18th of February, I'll just move on, February 1944 at Aprilia, right? Is that in Italy? I should know. Is a city and commune in the province of Latinia. Yes, the province down and about near Rome, where, as I learned with JC fairly recently, is where, oh God, it wasn't Odysseus. What was his name? The fella from Troy. My God, how have I forgotten his name? And he went to Carthage, and then he went to Rome, or Latinia, and married uh, the namesake of the area, Princess Latina, or something along those lines, Latina or Latinia. I'll have to move on because it's just a tangent on a tangent. It doesn't matter. I'm so embarrassed that I can't remember his name. But anyway, I'll think of it later. Not that it matters. So Aprilia, and sure, I've seen scooters or mopeds or small bikes named Aprilia. I'm pretty sure, like Piaggio. Everyone rides around on those in Italy and France. I used to think they were stupid, that you'd want a real motorbike. But anyway, Aprilia is a city and commune municipality in the province of Latinia, now incorporated into the conurbation of Rome in the Lazio region of central Italy. People might know it for the football team. It is the fifth most populous town in the region and the largest by area. Right, I'm just trying to find my place here again. During the Battle of Anzio, when Roger was 5, not just 5 years, 5 months old, so he never knew his father. Now it says that his father is commemorated in Aprilia and at the Casino, not Casino, but Casino or Casino War Cemetery. On 18th of February 2014, Waters unveiled a monument to his father and other war casualties in Aprilia, Italy, and was made an honorary citizen of Anzio. Following her husband's death, Mary Waters, also a teacher, moved with her 2 sons to Cambridge and raised them there. I think, Cambridge might be well known for its university. Maybe its cathedrals, and also there's a lot of technology research that goes on in there. Maybe they're in laboratories connected to the university. I have a feeling, all right, that there might also be, if not somewhere like GCHQ, because I know there's a main GCHQ somewhere else, but there may be some intelligence services places of Britain there as well. It's not too far outside of London, 55 miles north, 89 kilometres for anybody in metric land. Not too big of a town. It says the population of Cambridge was 145,000 in 2021. But there you go anyway. That could be just the specific city itself rather than the greater area. We'll move on. Moved with their 2 sons to Cambridge and raised them there. Waters' earliest memory is of the VJ, Victory in Japan Day celebrations. I'll read on a little bit. Waters attended Morley Memorial Junior School in Cambridge, and then the Cambridgeshire High School for Boys, now Hills Road Sixth Form College, with Sid Barrett. So he was the co-founder of Pink Floyd with Roger Waters. And I believe he had some psychological trauma or disturbed mentality, which I have a feeling might have led him to end his life early. I have a feeling. Or maybe not. Maybe he just went very funny in the head. I better not get into it. It's too much of a tangent off a tangent. We'll leave that for another time, I think. The future Pink Floyd guitarist David Gilmour lived nearby on Mill Road and attended the, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, if it's Perse or Pierce, Perse, Boys, now Pierce School. At 15, Waters was the chairman of the Cambridge Youth Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, having designed its publicity poster and participated in its organisation. Look, for right or for wrong, he seems to have had a conscience like his father. He was a keen sportsman and a highly regarded member of the high school's cricket and rugby teams. Waters was unhappy at school, saying, "I hated every second of it, apart from games. The regime at school was a very oppressive one. The same kids who are susceptible to bullying by other kids are also susceptible to bullying by the teachers." Waters met future the Pink Floyd. Maybe that's just a sort of a... Sometimes they make semantic or syntactical mistakes in Wikipedia. Waters met future Pink Floyd members Nick Mason and Richard Wright in London at the Regent Street Polytechnic. Later, the Polytechnic was kind of like a trade school. I think that was the equivalent in the UK, but that may be how they started, but turned into more like just regular high schools anyway, but just maybe not considered to be as posh like the private schools, which weirdly are called public schools in Britain or England. I've never understood it. I'm not sure if an English person would be capable of explaining it, but anyway. Later, the University of Westminster School of Architecture. Waters enrolled there in 1962 after a series of aptitude tests indicated he was well suited to that field. He had initially considered a career in mechanical engineering. Okay. I always liked mechanical engineering, electronic engineering, and pulling things apart and seeing how they worked and that kind of thing. Not that it matters, but I can relate in that sense. Maybe other people can. Right, back to this here. So I'll go back a bit because I'm not sure if I read this. So while anyone that was not drafted into World War II or Vietnam, I'm not wondering if I read this. Anyway, my point was that in The Wall, I'd guess he was born in the 50s and his parents cannot deal with his anger, isolation and confusion. And in his music and film, he's speaking to children born in the 60s and early 70s. I did read that out before, but worth recapping because it looks like maybe you didn't know. And of course, I'm not trying to, crow about the fact that I did, but I'd only recently sort of been reminded of the fact that Waters' father died early. I remember reading it a couple of years ago, so early that he never knew his father. So we can both now definitely understand that this would have affected Roger immensely, of course, throughout his whole life. So while anyone that was not drafted into World War II or Vietnam may not have understood that fear or those wounds, they were at least made aware of them. Wounds. I'm trying to pronounce things properly, and sometimes then, as I say with words like February, I tend to overpronounce them. They were at least made aware of them, and also made aware of the fact that things were not resolved, or at least not resolved satisfactorily. Yes. And the problem with Roger Waters' father dying so early like that, and the sense of not just loss, but that somebody has stolen from you, I would feel rage and umbrage and a sense of having been done such harm and wrong to that I don't think that I would be able to find a way to get over it. And I don't think I'd want to find a way because I'd want to essentially find the people who sent him over there and all the people who convinced him that it would be a good thing and confront them. And in the same way as I would like to find and confront everybody who instigated, fomented, and went along with what happened in 2020. And I not only can't find a way to reconcile myself with any of them ever again, but I don't want to. And I would see it as a climb down, a capitulation, and a loss. But just stating it because it's on my mind all the time, and I think it's relatable, comparable to that. Right, we'll move on. Now, as I'm a few years older than you, I can see how someone born in the late 70s, well, I don't want to be any more specific than the 70s, so I'll leave it at that, might view veterans as ancient black and white, irrelevant old fogies like Grandpa Simpson, even though he's yellow. Yeah, I get it. He's my favourite Simpson. All right. Well, look, but you may still be older than me. Um, and likely you are. But let me know what decade you were born in, maybe. But even if you were born in the 70s, you could, like, I would see if somebody was born like 2 or 3 years older than me. Of course, when I was a child, they would have seemed very much older than me. The bigger boys, you know. And even to this day, if somebody would be just 2 or 3 years older than me, in my mind, I would immediately relate that to when we must have been younger, and I would still see them as not just being older than me, but perhaps there would be definitely an element of an authority figure, which perhaps I shouldn't admit because that displays a weakness that I would have then, psychological weakness, and well, it's an insight anyway. But I'm mentioning it because it again might be relatable and part of the common human experience. Anyway, he says, I wholeheartedly believe that's the case because my younger brother did not watch The Wall, nor did he care to see it. Well, I don't think that I was just aware of it. But anyway, I believe children, and the other thing is that if I had wanted to watch it, if you wanted to buy a movie or a DVD or a CD, these things were typically 15 to 20 pounds, dollars, whatever. Now maybe things were cheaper in the US, and they probably were. But in Britain and in Ireland, things were quite expensive. And when I was a teenager, I didn't have any disposable income. Um, I won't get into the I would have had part-time jobs, but I won't get into the well, I suppose I will, but it needs to be compared. I would have earned, and again, people are going to think, "Oh, that's old and diddly olden days," but it wasn't. It's just that I agree that there is such a thing as inflation, but at the same time, I'll give you an example. Like in the early '90s, late '80s, maybe early '90s, anyway. If I would have had part-time jobs from at least from the early '90s, anyway, um, I would have earned something like £2.50, somewhere between two and maybe sometimes less. It might have been £1.80 pence, up to maybe £3 if I was earning time and a half or something, So £3 would have been at the very top of what you could earn, and at the same time, a pint of beer would have been £2. So, like, my attitude was that I can drink more than a pint of beer in an hour. You'd have to nurse a pint for an hour, like, mull over it for a while. And my attitude was like that unless you can earn more per hour than you can drink, that seemed to me to be a gauge mark, certainly in my teenage years, per hour, then you're not earning enough. A pack of cigarettes would have been at the time around the same price, maybe £2 or €2 maybe later, but they soon went up. I don't know what they are now, cigarettes, but they could well be €15. So if people think they're earning €15 or pounds or dollars an hour, maybe inflation has taken care of it. So that €15 an hour seems exorbitant to me for the teenage wage per hour, or salary, however you want to say it. But at the same time, there's no CDs or DVDs anymore. But if you were to buy one, that's where you'd be able to buy it with an hour's work. But you'd have to work for a whole day, to or 7 or 8 hours to be able to afford a CD or more. So there you go. That's a gauge mark. Right, I'll move on with my Grandpa Simpson and onions tied to my belt type story there. I know that Gen Z will hear that and think that's exactly what it is, but it isn't. Because the 90s were only yesterday, even though people will tell me, no, they weren't. The early 90s were 30 years ago. But anyway, I suppose, look, I have to mention it. I wanted to just read out the comment, but it would be shorter, but there wouldn't be much response then, really. I suppose I have to do this to add content or add value, whatever value some people might see in it. I believe children born a little later were more forward thinking. Well, very possibly. If you were born in the 60s, you may likely very well have had much more of a looking back to the 40s and 50s than kids born in the 70s or towards the 80s would have. Um, I believe children born a little later were more forward thinking and excited about tech promises that the 1980s brought. Absolutely. And for me, things like E.T. brought that in, and Star Wars, of course. But like both of them, and I keep forgetting Spielberg with, or confusing Spielberg with Lucas, but Star Wars was Lucas and Spielberg was E.T., I'm pretty sure. But I think everyone is pretty much aware that George Lucas said that the look that he wanted for Star Wars was not futuristic, but a sort of a second-hand or used, or how would you say, a shabby, or dirty, or deteriorating future world, so that the future had come, had arrived, and then had deteriorated or degenerated, or started falling apart, like an empire in its last days. And that does make the thing so exciting, that, oh, the future that's going to unfold, like in Space Odyssey 2001, clean, white, bright. Or many of there's probably other better examples, maybe like Silent Running, or there's other ones now, and I just can't think of what they are. But they would have been, we'll get into 70s movies again, maybe like THX 1138, although that's a bit of a dystopia. But I think in that one there might have been the famous futuristic cars, which were actually going down the White Tunnel, which I think, I was going to say, no, it couldn't have been a tunnel in France. Maybe it was a tunnel in California, going through a mountain that had white tiles on the inside. And the cars were really, I think, famously Lotus Formula One cars, but dressed up as with a different body shell, to look like everyone just had sort of basically Formula One hover cars, basically, in the future, that kind of thing. Anyway, a huge amount of the late 60s and early 70s, maybe even late 70s, no, all throughout the 70s, of future films. Even Family Guy did a sort of a joke that by making a pastiche out of that, there seems to be sort of similar themes of humans becoming, well, really like they're becoming now, homogenized, intergender, fungible biological machines, and the robots then pulling their human face off and revealing that they're a robot, just mechanical pieces underneath. I must get into it another time, because obviously it's all very analogous to, you could see, as a metaphor and as a reality and as a metaphor for what's happening to humanity now. But I better move on. Yeah, so the technology in the 80s. Oh no, and I was going to say an ET with the speak and spell, which wasn't something that I had until maybe later, if I managed to pick one up at what we would call a car boot sale or a yard sale, or what we would sometimes call a sale of work. I'm not sure what the equivalent is called in the States, but I don't think that term is used anymore now. Anyway, like a bake sale or a church sale or a town hall sale, that kind of thing. So maybe if some older, bigger boy, or older sister of somebody would have said, their parents would have said, we're doing a clear out of your room. Do you want this anymore? You're too old for this. And they'd put it into the church sale. And maybe somebody like me might be lucky enough to buy it. And maybe it wouldn't work either, you see. And so I'd be able to take it home and sort of say, well, what's wrong here? Why do I not get any sound? You'd open it up and you'd just say, oh, well, this wire isn't connected to the speaker anymore. Your first fix, in case that might come out wrong, the first time you ever fix something, and you build on your skills. And I think that's maybe how, well, certainly how somebody like me, or if a toy breaks, you think, well, it's not getting any more broken. It either gets thrown out, or I fix it, or I don't fix it, but I've learned something. But I don't think that was a common universal experience, but that's how I got into fixing things and being curious about what was inside things and how things worked. But in E.T. anyway, the idea that he had to sort of dismantle this speak and spell toy, and it seemed amazing to me that electronics could actually talk to you. That was a breakthrough, even if it was just like sort of, like robots at the time were sort of like, beepity beep, beepity beep. And I suppose I'm doing things like, Battlestar Galactica and things like that they all had a very limited range of vocabulary. Strange. I'm overpronouncing things again. Or that the synthesized voice sounded like you knew it wasn't a human. But that's the thing now. What really unnerves us now is we're beyond the uncanny valley into a point where you cannot reliably tell when a voice is computer generated. So there's now something comforting about the old tech. But anyway, in the past, anyway, in ET, there was something fascinating about ET. Basically, just utilizing, I say utilizing because he's making use of rather than just using technology that we thought was high tech at the time, around 85 or whenever it came out. But that he was like, oh, let me use this primitive toy to sort of, like in a MacGyver fashion, another series from the 80s or maybe early 90s, to make into a more sophisticated space age 21st century adult piece of equipment that we thought we would be once we get into this 21st century future that ET in the late 20th century was showing us. Right, I think I've said that well enough, and I think it was worthwhile, but I move on. They grew up with a TV in every house. Well, yes, we did have a TV, a color TV. Well, not everybody had a color TV. Some people had a black and white television, especially if you were, on holidays somewhere, whether it be in a rental house or in a mobile home or caravan or whatever. Because really big time in the 70s, it was the British who really loved, not so much the Irish, but to some extent, but the British really loved their caravans, as Jeremy Clarkson, I suppose, made well known now to American people. I know there's an RV culture in America, but that's too rich for, certainly was and still is for most British people. I've since learned, by the way, that the Germans and the Dutch love camping as well. So there's a lot of common, a huge amount of common ground with all people of Anglo-Saxon heritage. But anyway, and with games consoles and video game consoles, I'll just say, look, I think my family, our household, was an exception in that my mother was extremely strict with us, myself and my siblings, and we were not allowed to have a video recorder. We're not allowed to have a VCR. Just out of the question. You watch too much TV as it is, get out and get out into the fresh air or whatever, But that was a common thing for a lot of people as well. And there was even a TV show at the time, a British TV show. You see, I'll just say this, we got British TV, right? Being on the east coast of Ireland, they would often call us West Brits as an insult. Work that out for yourselves if it doesn't become apparent. Just look at a map. I'm trying to think what the equivalent of it would be like, and it might be. I don't know if it really happens, but let's say I'll say this, right. I was going to invoke Germany and France, but I'll say this, right. So in France, certainly Parisians, right, and believe it or not, right, as far as I understood it anyway, they actually look down on people who speak French with a Swiss accent. They think it's a very odd accent, although I'm not sure that I could. Maybe I would be able to pick up the difference. And they also look down on Belgians, right? And I think it's the way it goes with everything, right? If there's neighbouring countries and one's smaller, there's a sort of big brother, little brother type thing. But anyway, I think that they think that the Belgian accent as well makes them sound like, who knows what the exact equivalent is, but unsophisticated, let's say, whether that's country bumpkins or just not city people or whatever. And of course, Parisians would think of people outside of Paris as being unsophisticated in that sense as well, agrarian, whatever, But imagine maybe maybe if you're Parisian and you were calling people, let's say, from Normandy or somewhere, that might be bordering Belgium, right? You might call, I don't know if they do, but let's suppose if you might call them people from northern France there, far south Belgians, something like that. So you get the idea. Anyway, didn't mean to go off on a tangent for something perhaps now I feel is probably easily understood, but anyway, it might be interesting to know that from my perspective then, we got pretty much all the UK or British TV just because it came across the water easily. You could pick it up with your own, with an aerial that would be on your roof of your house anyway. You wouldn't be able to pick it up necessarily with just what we called was bunny's ears or, antenna on top of the TV. Lots of these grandpa with the style at the time, with the onions in my belt stories coming out now, aren't there? We also got pretty much whatever was the main American TV shows, you know. I was just thinking there today, as well as I loved watching Knight Rider, I loved watching the A Team, but I preferred the Fall Guy. And oh boy, even though I might have been only, well, less than 10 years old, if anybody remembers Jodie, the stunt woman actress, you know, who hung around with the Fall Guy and Howie, who sort of provided comic relief. Jodie, oh yeah. Um, I mean, I I don't think that well, I won't get into it, but I mean, like, I didn't just kind of go, oh, she's a nice lady, you know. And if you look back at her now, I think her name wasn't Heather Locklear, but it might have been called. I think she might have been called Heather Thomas or something like that. But anyway, it doesn't matter. If anybody isn't familiar with her, look back at her old photos. I don't know what she looks like now, but if you look back at her old photos, hands down, I still think that she was probably better looking than I think famously. This is a tangent again, of course, but anyway, whatever. Colt Seavers was the name of the character, but the actor's name was Lee Majors, and he married Farrah Fawcett, who was the iconic sort of rollerblade girl or whatever of the 70s. Blonde hair, Californian, all American girl. But I think that, objectively speaking, but of course it's open to a matter of taste, to be interested here. Not that it really matters whether anybody thinks one is better looking than the other, but in my memory, Heather Thomas, if that's her name, anyway, Jodie, the character in The Fall Guy, oh yeah. Don't mean to be getting crude about it, but like, she was hands down better looking than anybody. But anyway, other TV shows, all the TV shows, you know, and of course Daisy, right? Better mention her. If you go back and look at the original, and I can't remember. Now I know the one who was famous in the early 2000s. Can't think of her name. When they did a remake, oh, she was fine, no problem. But I think if you go back and look at the original, she wasn't called Barbara Bach, but I think her surname might have been Bach as well, Bach. She was incredible, absolutely out of this world incredible. In the Dukes of Hazzard. And what are the TV shows? Well, basically what I'm trying to say is we pretty much got all the American TV shows as well. Replayed probably just through whatever British TV shows, channels there were, and Irish TV channels. Well, there was really only one throughout the 80s, and only two channels of Irish TV, believe it or not, back then as well. And the second TV channel didn't probably start until 6 p.m. But that was probably similar for a lot of regional channels in the US as well. But we thought we were very backwards. But we got whatever Canadian TV shows were going as well. I think Beachcombers was a Canadian TV show. And there was others as well. And then, of course, from the late 80s and 90s, we got all the Australian TV shows, mostly soap operas, you know. Well, I mean, whichever was the main ones, you know. So just to fill you in there. So I got the sense that, you know, from where I was situated, I felt, and probably everybody feels this though, that I was in the centre of the world, that the world map, if you've noticed this, right? The world map tends to put your continent or country in the centre. Although I have been in the US and seen that there are maps there where Europe is in the centre. So it's a strange thing. I did get the impression that this little island was the centre of things, and America was to the west and Europe was to the east. But I remember I spent a little time in France, well, when I was a kid as well, and being in a classroom there. And I don't know if it's still the case, but they used to always have, you know, maps that you could pull down over the chalkboard. We called it a blackboard. But I remember noticing that things were basically shifted one time zone to the left, so that France was in the centre there. So that put me right in things. I went, I wonder if this is like the same thing everywhere. If I was in Japan, if I was in a classroom there, if they pulled down the blind or screen or whatever, would Japan be in the centre? Probably. You know, to have the Pacific as the centre there. But anyway, look, I'll move on. But again, look, this channel is all about eternal extrapolations, extrapolating from one thing to another. And all this stuff is obvious. But I would like to think that it might resonate and kind of jog, not memories, but the same realizations with other people. So they might kind of go, oh yeah, I did think that, but I'd never articulated that thought, let alone vocalized it. And the reason I say that is not to sort of go, well, there you go, I was insightful enough to do that. No, I'm not saying that. But I just somehow just feel that it's useful to make connections like that, both connections of logic and between different human minds across the ether, the airwaves, radio waves, internet waves of the internet. I'll move on and back on now. I think I got that there because I kind of felt that there was an assumption being made about everybody growing up with video games, consoles, and VCRs and whatnot. But we certainly weren't saturated with TV. But at the same time, I think that, as I say, my family might have been an exception, and that there could have been a lot of my, I was going to say colleagues, but now, yes, but school friends at the time who would have had a lot more disposable income, I think were given pocket money that allowed them to buy most of the things that they wanted. Or maybe some of them, to be fair, would have had jobs cutting grass or whatever, and I don't know how they did it, but earned more money and were able to save up and buy video games, consoles, and whatever, So they may have had a different experience growing up. But I felt that we were deprived, very hard done by not having a VCR. or not having a video games console like a Nintendo or a Sega. But my younger brother would definitely have a very different cultural experience and therefore impression of a band like Pink Floyd. Now, funnily enough, I think we agree there because I was deprived, yes, but let's say my youngest brother, he would have had a different experience because I think by that stage we were allowed to have video games, consoles. But I mean, kind of too late for me, really, to have one growing up then as a teenager. But my youngest brother would have been still, a teenager, and games, consoles, and VCRs and color TV in several different rooms and whatever, I will give this example, although it's probably not good. When I was a teenager, I was a rebel. And a big part of being a rebel was, I think, because I thought that it might be impressive to girls, to be quite honest about it. I thought that might be impressive to girls. Oh, he's such a rebel. Oh, he's such a dreamboat. Whatever. I doubt it worked. But anyway, I was not allowed to drink or smoke. So naturally I did. But I was constantly getting into trouble, Sometimes I'd admit, okay, fine, I had a quick drink, right? You're in trouble, or you're not going out next weekend, or, you're grounded, whatever. Or I'd be caught with cigarettes or the smell of cigarettes on me, right? That's it. You're grounded. You're not going out next week. No, that thing that you wanted to go to that party or that concert, well, you're not going. And as I say, my parents were very strict, so punishments like that would stick. I mean, it wouldn't matter if I'd bought a concert ticket or a year ago, or if it was at my best friend's birthday or whatever. It just didn't matter. My mother would say, well, you just have to call them up and explain why you can't go, and yes, you can tell them you have a very mean mother if you want, but you're not going. And she would stick to it. And so I hated my parents, because I thought it was all most unfair. But my youngest brother, when he was my age then, when I was getting grounded, let's say if I was 15, 16 and getting grounded all the time for drinking or smoking or coming home late or sneaking out or whatever, my youngest brother, he could have his friends over and they'd all be, maybe sitting in the garden or even sitting indoors, or, they'd all be there in the living room or whatever, smoking and drinking. Yeah, even indoors. And my mother then would sometimes, knock on the door and go, oh, sorry to disturb you. Disturb you. She didn't speak like that. Sorry to disturb you, boys. I'm going into town. Can I get anybody any more beer or cigarettes? Anybody? And when I heard that, I was like, what? Why were you doing that? Why wasn't I treated like that? And she's like, oh, well, listen, you were different. You were very bold. Whatever, you were a very unruly child. You couldn't be behaved, And I said, but I would be if he had allowed me to drink or cigarette, whatever, you know what I mean? But as she explained later, I think she said, look, you've only got so much energy. And as the years went by, I got more mellow, or I just kind of went, look, you're going to do what you're going to do, or at least he's under my roof. I can see what he's doing, all this sort of stuff. So look, people get changed and maybe they don't have the energy. People change, they don't have the energy to be as strict with the earlier ones, like me. But anyway, There you are. People from the same family, from the youngest to the oldest, can have not only different experiences growing up, even if they might only be separated by a decade or something like that. But I hadn't realized until recently, because I consider myself to be Generation X, and so therefore I assumed all my brothers and um, I assumed that we all were of the same generation. But I think this must be why they have Generation Y then, or millennials, whatever exactly is the difference there. So that does make sense now, that two people can have children, but the children don't aren't necessarily of the same generation. Because I think that a logical fallacy or an assumption or a premise that I was uh, falsely laboring under was that all children of the same parents or all brothers and sisters are automatically, by definition, from the same generation, but apparently not. So let me know whether you agree or not. Anyway, next paragraph. And yes, his friends. Oh no, well, I better finish off this. Have a very different cultural experience and therefore impression of a band like Pink Floyd. Yes. And as I said before, Pink Floyd were a bit before my time. And I think, as we can see from the dates there, and you said yourself said they were singing to the children of the 60s and the 70s, but you would have had to have been a teenager at least in the 1970s. And I wasn't, I was just born in the 1970s. So, and yes, his friends would have looked at listening to that as classic rock or older music. While when I was a little girl, it was playing in every store. Okay, so you're a woman. A woman. um, when I was a little girl, it was playing in every store. Right. Okay. And I think we'll get on to that in the next comment. As I say, I'm doing this out of order, but I'll do a second video. I think for the other comment. I mean, for sure now, because this goes on for so long in itself. But look, hopefully it's interesting to not just yourself, but other people. Now, an interesting note, back to this. In the US, Pink Floyd was blacklisted. Oh no, this is the comment I was thinking of. But I'll do another comment for your other comment. Or another video, rather, for your other comment. In the US, Pink Floyd was blacklisted and not played on the radio, even though they had the top-selling album in the country, and I think the world, at the time, because they refused to do Payola. I better look this up. I've heard of Payola vaguely, but I don't know what it is. I can guess, but I'll look it up and get the definition at the very least. I think the equivalent in the UK might be called IMRO, or sorry, that must be Ireland. Maybe it's, I don't know whether it stands for Irish or International Music Rights Organization. Anyway, summary here from Wikipedia, I guess. Payola in the music industry is the illegal practice of paying a commercial radio station to play a song. It's not the same thing now. To play a song without the station disclosing the payment. Under US law, a radio station must disclose songs they were paid to play on the air as sponsored airtime. The term payola was coined by Variety, is that magazine, in 1938 to refer to gifts. I suppose, like we might say, cashola does imply, I'll give you a bit of cashola there. Is not exactly a bribe, but money under the table, at the very least, non-taxable or black market money, maybe. So maybe there could be a comparison there to payola. The term payola was coined by Variety in 1938 to refer to gifts, favours, or cash surreptitiously dispensed by record companies to get orchestra, leaders, and disc jockeys to play their songs. Goes back as far as orchestra leaders, maybe in theatres or cinemas. The number of times the songs are played can influence, because believe it or not, I mean, well, maybe people know this, people used to not buy records and vinyl. Before that, they bought the sheet music and went home and played it on the piano. My God. And of course, that brings in, what was the name of that? Tin Pan Alley, which I didn't find out until years later exactly what Tin Pan Alley was. I thought it just meant a cacophony of people banging metal drums and, bins, dumpsters, trash cans in back alleys. But no, as far as I understand, Tin Pan Alley was the equivalent of these days, where you have basically about a handful of writers writing everybody's songs. Like Katy Perry wouldn't necessarily have written any of her songs, but she might have co-writer credit or whatever, but there's the same group of people who are writing all the hit songs and they're writing it to a very formulaic way. Well, it's not a new concept, so I think even back then in the Tin Pan Alley there was people doing that. And I'll just say this if people want to look into it, there is a common thread if you start looking at people's names and their backgrounds and histories and when they were born and their early life, a common theme, a common thread rather. Interesting. So it was coined by Variety in 1938 to refer to gifts, favours, or cash surreptitiously dispensed by record companies to get orchestra leaders and disc jockeys to play their songs. The number of times the songs are played can influence the perceived popularity of a song. Of course, as we see with the internet, through signal reduction, signal boosting. On Twitter, same principle applies to opinions. It can influence the perceived popularity of an opinion, and therefore, as we know, how easily malleable other people's opinions are, or how easily it is to mold their minds, just like it is to make a song popular in their heads. I suppose, it's a very obvious comparison to draw, but in case people weren't quite there, I think it might help to hear somebody else articulate or elucidate it, even though you might kind of go, yeah, duh, obviously. But this is why they want to have control over how they can manipulate people's perceptions by artificially influencing the perceived popularity of a song or a political opinion. Which is why they care so much about whether there's Russian bots repeating talking points, whether that's true or not, or whether they believe that it's true or not, or whether it's bots or whether it's just, human parrots who don't know any better and don't think that they're part of the problem, but are repeating opinions that aren't even their own, and they don't know how they arrived at these opinions. And the reason they don't know is because they never did, because these opinions were pushed into their minds because they don't have, as JC often says, an equivalent of a firewall for their brain to keep bad ideas out, or at least to keep the possibility of not forming their own ideas. The number of times the songs are played can influence the perceived popularity of a song, and payola may be used to influence these meters. During the hearings conducted by Congressman Orrin Harris, that's O-R-E-N, and his subcommittee on legislative oversight, the term was sometimes used as a blanket reference to a range of corrupt practices in the radio and recording industries. I'm very glad I looked it up, and I think that is a key point in there for people to ponder. Okay. So that all came to light, and they were ultimately forced to play their music due to demand, even though Pink Floyd then, and maybe Roger Waters, to me that indicates they were principled people and said, we are not going to participate in a corrupt practice. We're not going to pay you to get our songs played on the radio and therefore to become more popular. We're going to make it by our own standards or not at all. I really admire and respect that. I'm maybe ascribing something to them that might be wrong, but I think it's likely to be in that ballpark. They're thinking on it. Either Roger Waters or all of them. Although maybe that was part of the fracture. You never know. Maybe David Gilmour might have said, look, just go ahead, and you can't buck the system, and just work with the system. Stop always being so negative or trying to headbutt or butt the system or butt up against it. As you see now again, in the parallel, people would say, oh, look, and you can't be always protesting, and why not just go along to get along? Not my problem. That's the system as it is. You can't fight the system. You see? A lot of parallels. Maybe pure conjecture there, but we'll move on. So I think they are quite used to doing, not used, I pronounce it as used. They are quite used to doing things and saying things about existing systems and institutions that people did not discuss. Well, I think that does speak to what I was sort of engaging in a bit of conjecture there about as well. I think you might be surmising the same thing. I also find it interesting that perhaps in the end the system did win, because 5 years later they weren't really on everyone's radar anymore, while other older bands still got heavy rotation radio play. That's interesting to me. And as you can see, it was interesting to me too. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to do a lengthy outro sign off. What did we learn today, children? because I think we got there, and I think that was useful. I appreciate it. I'm going to try and do a second one, and maybe I'll leave it till a bit later, or maybe even tomorrow. Don't want to oversaturate you or other people. But I didn't expect that to be as long as it was, even though I do think, although I say so myself, I think that was worthwhile. And I appreciate the tangential extrapolations, let's call them, tangential thoughts that I had, seeded or generated or sparked by what you had written there. Very interesting. I could have, of course, looked up Roger Waters, Pink Floyd, Payola, other things like that, and learned about them without having read your comment. But like so many things, all the information is there at our fingertips these days. But sometimes what is the germination of an idea is still needed. And I think actually that cannot be replaced by AI. See, AI, I'll finish off with this thought, can create, but only can create based on the germination of an idea from a human mind. Can it do so autonomously? I don't think so. Never say never, because I never thought AI would get to be this impressive, whatever exactly AI is, whether it's artificial or augmented intelligence or autonomous intelligence or pseudo-intelligence, whatever. But if it does get to the stage where the AI can just sit there in a big computer mainframe or internet network and then go, oh, I know, I've just had an idea, or I just randomly went off and looked at a video and that's given me an idea. If that does happen, I think that'll be another day where I get very frightened for the future of humanity. I'll leave it at that. And thank you for listening, and thank you for your comment.